television was built on the promise of bringing the world into your living room. The news, the games, the ceremonies, moments of triumph beamed directly to millions of people at once. But sometimes, the world that came through that screen was something no one was prepared for. Something that couldn't be edited out or delayed. Something that happened in real time and stayed there, burned into the memory of everyone watching. These weren't disasters captured on tape and played back later. They weren't reconstructions or dramatizations. They were live. The cameras were already rolling. The anchors were already talking. And then something went wrong in a way that no producer, no director, no viewer could have anticipated or stopped. Some of these moments reshaped journalism itself. Others left entire nations in a state of collective shock. A few are still so raw, so deeply uncomfortable, that the footage has never been widely seen again. What connects all of them is the same terrible quality. Ordinary people sitting in their homes, watching television, and witnessing something that no amount of preparation could have made bearable. Here are the 5 most horrific moments in live TV history. It was the morning of November 24th, 1963. 2 days had passed since President John F. Kennedy was shot dead in a motorcade in Dallas, and the country was still numb. Lee Harvey Oswald, the man accused of firing those shots, sat in Dallas City Jail. That Sunday morning, the Dallas police were ready to transfer him to the county jail, and every major television network had cameras in position to cover it. The transfer was supposed to happen at noon. Bowing to requests from reporters who had flooded the narrow basement corridor of police headquarters, officials scheduled it as something close to a media event. NBC would carry it live. The other networks would record it on tape. The basement was jammed with reporters, cables, and the blinding white light of television cameras. It was chaotic and poorly controlled, and almost anyone could have walked into that corridor without being stopped. Oswald came out 5 minutes late. He had changed his sweater. He walked slowly in handcuffs, flanked by 2 detectives. CBS radio correspondent Ike Pappas thrust a microphone toward him and asked if he had anything to say in his defense. He never answered. Jack Ruby, a Dallas nightclub owner, stepped forward from where he had been standing among the reporters and fired a single shot into Oswald's abdomen at point-blank range. NBC reporter Tom Pettit, watching it unfold directly in front of him, kept repeating into his microphone, "He's been shot. He's been shot. Lee Oswald has been shot." Millions of people watching NBC saw it happen in real time. The other networks' audiences saw it within hours on tape. It was the first murder ever broadcast live on American national television, arriving just 2 days after the most traumatic political killing the country had ever known. The irony of how television made the shooting possible was not lost on everyone. Writer Jonathan Miller noted in The New Yorker that by pressing the police for live access and flooding that basement with cameras and reporters, television had created the very conditions that allowed Ruby to walk in undetected. One could almost feel, Miller wrote, the lens urging Ruby out of the crowd. It looked as though he had come out of the camera itself. Oswald was rushed to Parkland Memorial Hospital, the same hospital where Kennedy had been pronounced dead 2 days earlier. He was gone within 2 hours. What followed was a period of national mourning that television covered with a thoroughness and gravity it had never managed before. 41 camera units from the 3 major networks combined their coverage for the funeral. Walter Cronkite, who had cracked on air when he confirmed Kennedy's death 2 days prior, anchored hours of coverage that drew the largest domestic television audience the medium had ever seen. What had been a print and radio nation became, in the space of 4 days, a television nation. Scholar Barbie Zielizer later noted that this was the event that legitimized television in the eyes of the public, and that after it was over, print would never again challenge television as the primary source of news and authority. One television executive, looking back, put it plainly, "I think we were frightened when we saw our capability." The murder of Oswald was the moment that proved what live television could do. It was also the moment that proved what live television could never take back. From Ruby's single shot forward, the news would never work the same way again. The camera had become part of the story, and no one fully understood yet what that meant. It was the morning of July 15, 1974. At WXLT-TV, a small ABC affiliate in Sarasota, Florida, the 9 o'clock hour was just getting started. Christine Chubbuck, the 29-year-old host of a community affairs program called Suncoast Digest, had told her coworkers something slightly unusual that morning. She needed to read a newscast before her show began. She had never done that before, and it confused the people around her, but no one stopped her. Chubbuck had been at the station for about 2 years. She took her work seriously and cared about local stories, the kind of community-level reporting that most stations pushed aside for anything with blood in the headline. She had also been struggling privately for a long time. Depression, loneliness, a sense that her personal life had failed her in ways she couldn't repair. Her mother knew about the suicidal thoughts but said nothing to station management, afraid her daughter would lose her job. A week before that July morning, Chubbuck told a night news editor she had bought a gun and joked about using it on air. He assumed it was dark humor, the kind she sometimes leaned on, and changed the subject. On the morning of July 15, 1974, Chubbuck sat at the news anchor's desk and read through 3 national stories. Then she got to a 4th, a local shooting at a restaurant near the Sarasota-Bradenton airport. The film reel jammed. She shrugged it off calmly, looked into the camera, and said, "In keeping with the WXLT practice of presenting the most immediate and complete reports of local blood and guts news, TV40 presents what is believed to be a television first, in living color, an exclusive coverage of an attempted suicide." Some viewers assumed it was a bad joke. Some of her colleagues, watching from elsewhere in the building, thought the same thing. Then she reached into her bag, drew a .38 caliber revolver, and shot herself behind her right ear. She slumped forward violently onto the desk. The technical director faded the broadcast to black as fast as he could. Phones at the station and at the police department started ringing immediately. Some callers still thought it was a stunt. WXLT ran a public service announcement and then a movie to fill the dead airtime. News director Mike Simmons found something waiting for him after the broadcast. Chubbuck had left behind a complete script of the program, including a third-person account of the shooting written as if to be read by whoever took over after her. She had predicted her own condition as critical. She had written the follow-up story herself. She had also requested that the episode be recorded, something the station didn't normally do because of the cost of tape. That request is the only reason any record of the broadcast exists at all. Chubbuck was taken to Sarasota Memorial Hospital, where she was pronounced dead 14 hours later. The tape has never been publicly released. Her family obtained it after an injunction against the station and is said to have destroyed the original copies. A confirmed second copy later surfaced in the possession of the widow of the station's former owner. She handed it to a law firm for safekeeping and has stated she has no intention of ever making it public. What remains is the audio, portions of which were confirmed authentic in 2021, along with the accounts of those who were there, still unsettled decades later, still struggling to explain how so many warning signs added up to nothing. What made the broadcast so deeply disturbing wasn't just what happened, it was how carefully it had been planned. Chubbuck had written the announcement. She had scripted the aftermath. She had arranged for the tape. Every detail had been thought through and prepared in advance, and the people closest to her had no idea. The cameras were already rolling. The audience was already watching, and she had known exactly what she was going to do. It was the early morning of September 5th, 1972. Munich was hosting the Summer Olympic Games, and the mood across the city had been deliberately open and warm. West Germany wanted these games to feel welcoming, a conscious contrast to the rigid, controlled spectacle of the 1936 Berlin Olympics. Security was light. Fences were low. Jeffrey Mason, a young ABC producer expecting a quiet shift, was heading into the broadcast center around 5:30 in the morning when he noticed police cars gathering outside. The broadcast center sat just 100 yards from the Olympic Village. Whatever was happening, it was close. By the time the full picture came together, it was already a crisis. Members of the Palestinian militant group Black September had broken into the building housing the Israeli Olympic delegation during the night. A weightlifter and a wrestling coach were killed in the initial assault. 9 other athletes and coaches were taken hostage. Medal competitions were suspended. The games, for the first time in their modern history, went quiet. ABC Sports president Roone Arledge made the call immediately. They would stay live until it was over. Anchor Jim McKay took his seat in the studio and wouldn't leave it for the next 16 hours. Arledge had thought carefully about what happened in 1963, when NBC held the only live camera in the Dallas police basement when Jack Ruby shot Oswald. He had no intention of repeating that mistake from the other side. The cardinal error, Arledge later said, is to be there with the only live camera and then miss whatever might happen. Mason and his crew wheeled a large camera outside and positioned it to overlook Building 31, where the hostages were being held. Peter Jennings, who covered the Middle East for ABC News and had come to Munich as something close to a working holiday, put on an Olympic uniform, used fake credentials, and got himself onto the 11th floor of the building housing the Italian delegation. From there, he kept watch through the night, communicating back to the broadcast team by walkie-talkie and telephone. Because of his background in the region, he identified Black September as the likely perpetrators before any official confirmation arrived. The world watched. An estimated 900 million viewers followed the coverage across the day. They watched masked gunmen standing on balconies. They watched negotiators coming and going. They watched helicopters lift off and disappear toward the horizon. What they didn't yet know was that the rescue was already falling apart. Just past midnight on September 6th, word came back from Fürstenfeldbruck Air Base, where German police had attempted to intercept the gunmen and free the hostages. The operation had failed. 8 of the hostages were killed by gunfire. A 9th, David Berger, was gone after a grenade was thrown into one of the helicopters, causing it to explode. 11 Israeli athletes and coaches were dead in total. McKay delivered the news to an audience that had been watching for the better part of a day. He had been on air for more than 16 hours. He said quietly, "They're all gone." Mason walked back to his hotel with a colleague. They poured drinks. They cried. In the years that followed, he said he felt only sadness whenever he returned to that day, no matter how many times he was asked about it. ABC's coverage eventually won 29 Emmy Awards. Walter Cronkite sent McKay a telegram of commendation. None of that softened what the broadcast had put in front of its audience. A terrorist attack unfolding across an entire day, in real time, watched by more people than had ever watched anything on television before. It was the first act of terrorism broadcast live to a global audience. The cameras had been there for the opening ceremony. They were there at the end, too, for something no one had come to Munich to see. It was a cold, clear morning on January 28, 1986, at the Kennedy Space Center in Cape Canaveral, Florida. The launch of the Space Shuttle Challenger had already been delayed several times, most recently because of icicles on the launch pad. The temperature that morning was well below what the shuttle's engineers considered safe. A team of engineers at NASA contractor Morton Thiokol had spent the previous evening trying to stop the launch, warning that the rubber seals on the solid rocket boosters could fail in such cold. Their concerns were overruled. One of those engineers, Bob Ebeling, told his wife the night before, "It's going to blow up." Classrooms across the country had set up televisions that morning for a specific reason. Krista McAuliffe, a high school social studies teacher from Concord, New Hampshire, was aboard. She had been chosen from more than 11,000 candidates to become the first private citizen in space and had promised to teach lessons from orbit. Children were watching in schools. Families had gathered at the launch site. CNN carried the launch in full. The crowd at Cape Canaveral cheered as Challenger lifted off at 11:38 in the morning, climbing into that cold blue sky on a column of white smoke. 73 seconds later, it was over. A seal on the right side solid rocket booster, hardened by the overnight cold, had failed at the moment of liftoff. Hot gases burned through the gap and eventually breached the external fuel tank. The right booster came loose from its strut and slammed into the tank, releasing a fireball of liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. Both boosters tore free and spiraled away through a grotesque Y-shaped cloud of smoke and vapor. What the people watching at home saw was the shuttle disappearing into a white explosion high above the Atlantic Ocean. The public affairs officer at Mission Control noted that Challenger had gone to full throttle. Then there was nothing. A few seconds of silence before he said almost flatly that there had been a major malfunction. What most viewers didn't know in that moment was that the shuttle hadn't simply exploded. The crew cabin remained intact through the initial breakup. Without the boosters, it arced back down from an altitude of roughly 12 miles and fell for nearly 3 minutes before hitting the ocean at more than 200 miles per hour. Whether the crew survived the initial breakup long enough to know what was happening is still not fully settled. NASA concluded they probably lost consciousness quickly when the compartment depressurized. Others have argued the evidence is less clear than that. None of that information reached the people watching in real time. They saw fire and smoke and then nothing where the shuttle had been. At the launch site, families stood in silence, some crying, some unable to move. A NASA security guard who had witnessed dozens of launches turned to the crowd and said aloud, "Oh my God, it never did that before." President Reagan scrapped his scheduled State of the Union address that night and spoke instead about the crew. He addressed the school children who had been watching directly, acknowledging that sometimes painful things happen as part of exploration and discovery. He closed with a line drawn from a poem written by a World War II-era aviator, saying the astronauts had slipped the surly bonds of Earth to touch the face of God. The Rogers Commission investigation that followed confirmed what Ebeling and his colleagues had already known. The O-ring failure was foreseeable, and the warnings had been documented and dismissed. 7 people were gone. The country had watched it happen in real time, standing in classrooms and living rooms on a Tuesday morning, waiting for something that was supposed to be a triumph, witnessing instead something that no amount of careful preparation had managed to prevent. It was the afternoon of March 31st, 2013, at Lucas Oil Stadium in Indianapolis. The NCAA men's basketball tournament had reached the Elite Eight, and Louisville was facing Duke in the Midwest Regional Final. The game was being broadcast live on CBS to a national audience. Louisville guard Kevin Ware, a sophomore, had been having a strong season. The crowd was loud, the game was tight, and everything about the afternoon felt like ordinary March basketball. With just under 6 minutes left in the first half, Duke guard Tyler Thornton went up for a three-pointer from the right wing. Ware went up to contest the shot, came down, and landed wrong. What happened next stopped the game entirely. The bone in Ware's right leg snapped and broke through the skin. The fracture was visible from the stands, visible to the cameras, visible to everyone on the court. Thornton, who had been running back on defense, put both hands to his face. Players from both teams stopped where they were. Several of Ware's teammates dropped to the floor near him. Wayne Blackshear cried openly. Shane Behanen went down on his hands and knees. Peyton Silva sat on the court, one hand over his mouth, unable to look away and unable to keep looking. Louisville head coach Rick Pitino, a man who had spent decades coaching through pressure and pain, was seen wiping tears from his face on the sideline. CBS commentator Clark Kellogg called it gruesome on air. The network showed the replay twice in slow motion, though without a close-up of the fracture itself. After those 2 replays, CBS Sports chairman Sean McManus made the decision to pull it. The network would not show the footage again. Coverage shifted to reaction shots, the faces of players, the response of coaches, medical personnel working on Ware on the court. Cameras stayed above his waist while staff tended to his leg. At halftime, anchor Greg Gumbel confirmed on air that CBS was done showing the injury. McManus later said the network had no intention of highlighting it or zooming in on the wound. "I think we did the right thing," he said. The game continued. Ware was carried off on a stretcher, and from that stretcher he reportedly told his teammates to win. They did. Louisville beat Duke and went on to win the national championship. Ware watched the title game from a hospital bed. What made the moment so affecting was not just the injury itself, it was the context. This was not a combat zone or a crime scene or a collapsing structure. It was a college basketball game on a Sunday afternoon in March, the kind of thing tens of millions of Americans watch every year without incident. The play that caused it was completely routine. A defensive closeout, a movement Ware had made hundreds of times in practice and competition. There was no collision, no foul, Nothing in the lead-up that signaled anything unusual. He went up, he came down, and in a fraction of a second something went catastrophically wrong. The reaction of his teammates communicated something no broadcaster needed to put into words. These were young athletes who understood physical risk, who had pushed through sprains and bruises and fatigue for years. What they saw on that court registered as something categorically different from any injury they had witnessed before. It broke through whatever tolerance sport builds up in a person and left them on the floor, in tears, in front of a national television audience. CBS pulled the footage, and that was the right call. But the replay had already run twice before the decision was made. The people watching had already seen it. And unlike the events that preceded this one on this list, there was no political crisis, no militant group, no machinery failing at altitude. There was only a young man, a routine jump, and a moment that no one who saw it would easily forget.